Hagar. Welcome to IoT Coffee Talk.
Van Halen
I don't know how that sounded, but
It sounded awesome, dude.
It was awesome.
awesome.
How many hours were you practicing before that show?
0. we didn't rehearse, but
Wow.
our prayers out to the Van Halen family. What a huge loss for rock and roll. I mean, the ultimate loss for rock and roll. Greatest guitar player ever.
It's so sad.
Really super.
Total soundtrack of my childhood, and I think for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, big
For sure.
No doubt.
Yeah.
I remember when I was surfing and I rescued Brooke Shields, and then I blew the reward money on having Van Halen play my birthday party in the backyard.
Okay, Spicoli.
on the opposite side of that, and do not crucify me. So I know very little about the artist other than he was very influential. So I had a colleague who also grew up with Van Halen's music send me a video about Hot Teacher or the Bad Teacher.
Hot Teacher.
Yes. So I thought, I'm like, wow, like this was very edgy for, a couple of decades ago. Like, I was thinking about the reaction, but man, could he play like this solo riff. Anyway, so, sad that an influential artist has passed, and I'm going to, do some listening because I do like rock. I just don't, I just don't know the guy's music.
No, seriously, you have to listen to his stuff because when I listen back, I'm just blown away by what he did at the time. It was just completely revolutionary. And he was so innovative in many ways, not only with the equipment, but with his style of playing and the virtuosity. And it's not just because he played really fast. If you listen to some of his stuff, just the maturity for a guy that's like in his 20s. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like remarkable. And the stylistic, he had his own thing going on, and it's total attitude. And, listen to the Van Halen stuff. You'll be blown away. And then put yourself back in the 70s. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, this is like almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
That this guy was doing this.
I literally don't know what you're saying, but I hear you.
Yeah.
It was before the 1980s. That's when the 70s.
Yeah, before the 80s, before the less than zero decade.
Yeah. And then Diamond Dave, man. Diamond Dave. That dude.
Yeah.
Crazy. You want to talk
You have to be able to do splits in midair on stage while you're singing.
You want to talk about stuff that like Usher could not pull off on stage. You know what I'm saying?
The other thing a lot of people forget or maybe know him by, like Eddie Van Halen stuff with Michael Jackson. That's a lot of riffs that people know, right?
Yeah.
Right. Beat it. Yeah.
And it was single take that he did for free.
Yeah.
And it's like one of the greatest guitar solos ever. And it's really hard to play.
Yeah. It's crazy. The first person who reached out to me yesterday just about this, who just said, showing lots of people's age, is like, it's like, dude, I literally saw him open for Black Sabbath in '77, and they totally destroyed Black Sabbath and made them look just like a bunch of nobodies.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well,
that Van Halen 1 was just mind-boggling album.
Yeah.
And in Texas, it was common, like every skate rink was Van Halen music. And so on the weekends, you'd go to the skate rink and you'd listen to your rock and roll. So that might date me, but hey, I don't even know how many skating rinks are actually open nowadays.
I miss roller skating rinks, yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Is that the kind that has the shag carpet on the walls?
Yes.
In case you're running really fast and you crash into a wall, you're good.
Oh, well, rest in peace, GOAT.
Yep.
Yeah. God bless. Thank you for all the great music and the great influence. So, Rick.
Yo.
What are we talking about?
IoT security.
Oh. Wow. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Is that a thing?
I think so.
I got shivers.
we'll link it in our group, but there was that, I think important breaking news today about the IoT connected chastity device that someone hacked. And, again, we'll link it in our group. But I mean, this
I'll put it up.
These are very, very real risks, right? You can end up with your some kid in Eastern Europe controlling access to your junk. That's kind of a big deal. So
Sure.
we need to be cautious about that. Reality is, I mean, the example I use all the time, that remember who watched Homeland on
Yes.
shows? Remember that?
Yes.
Everybody raised their hand except for Mark.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
The infamous episode where they hacked the pacemaker of the vice president.
Yes.
Kill him, right? Everybody says, "Oh, that's bullshit. That can't happen." Actually, I think there's a CVE 8870 or something like. It's a infamous vulnerability where a major med device manufacturer's pacemakers had two things going on. They had the operating system password was hard coded into the firmware, so basically could never be changed, right? So once you knew it, you knew it. So you had full privileges. You had to be in proximity to it. And then they left some debug software in there that lets you access any memory location in the pacemaker. Long story short, you basically needed no skills whatsoever to kill somebody. So thankfully it was fixed, but these things are very real. It doesn't always just have to be like, something mission critical, like a piece of healthcare equipment, right? Remember the zombie army of baby monitors, right? That were drafted into doing a DDoS attack. So,
right.
But what I was hoping we could talk about is kind of the whole chain, right? What's, what do you have to do on device? What do we have to do in the cloud? David brought that up, end to end, and then all the stuff in between. It's a big deal. And, it's not just, hey, I send it over HTTPS or TLS. It's a little bit more than that. So figure that will kick it off.
How much you want to increase the price of an IoT device to have it secure, or at least secure for today? How much would you increase that price? And
power. You remember when the first Arduino and other devices came out, you couldn't really run a TLS algorithm on them. Or there were a lot of the microcontrollers just very early on didn't have enough horsepower to run that encryption algorithm. People moving them into silicon and stuff like that certainly helps, but it's not like an optional thing. I think that early on in the Wild West of the IoT, it was like, nobody's going to hack my whatever it is. Well, that's not true, right? So, it can't be considered optional.
I totally remember when people really didn't care. I mean, a million years ago, like when I was doing the vending machine stuff in the 90s, and we were creating our own packets and everything. And you're right, there was no TLS, or there kind of was. Netscape had just created it, but we weren't initially doing it over IP. We were sending our own packets and creating our own modems. But I definitely remember lots of folks when they brought up the notion of what if somebody saw what the data was. A lot of people are like, who cares? It's just inventory information from a vending machine. It's not important. It's not national security or anything. And you would hear that attitude from time to time, like, we're not sending critical data, so who cares? But we should probably care.
And that's what, like the industrial automation space, when the moment people started connecting that kind of stuff to the internet, opened up these unbelievably massive vulnerabilities. And we used to talk about how the step change in risk from your attack surface and all the nasty things you can do between just sending data like your vending machines were to control. Like when you start opening and closing valves, changing settings, spinning up motors, things can get really dangerous. That's not what Stuxnet was, but again, an example of when you can control the physical device, the things that you can potentially do. So a lot of companies just avoid that because it's hard.
That's a really good point.
I would say that a lot of the early vulnerabilities were around infrastructure or like building management systems, access control, HVAC systems, elevators. When those things started getting hacked, it was like, oh, wow. When I hear all the consumer hacks, I'm like, yeah, it's privacy, it's this, that, and the other. But I think about the industrial side of it, even a manufacturing or a factory floor, the implications there, the dollar value tied to those hacks, those risks. especially if they get into personal information or transactional information or completely disrupt operations. Those are the eye-opening events that actually start to make the industry take a step back, right? But we were talking about this, a week ago maybe 2-3 days ago, about IoT security is actually finally starting to rise to the top. What are you guys seeing in terms of customer situations or any events that are triggering that, other than COVID-19 changing the way we do business?
Well, for as usual, me and my being a fan of words have meaning. So how do we start to define what IoT security is? And should we start at the is this a hardware conversation before we even go any further? Is that Mark shaking his head is fine. So is this a system on chip? Is this a microcontroller? Is this a finished gateway? Is this the finished modem? When we think of hardware and knowing that we will necessitate hardware for data acquisition, should the security conversation start there? Because if I go industrial to Rick's point, and I'm going into a brownfield operation, I have to bring a device to connect to something else. And if I have security issues, well, I might just compromise this variable frequency drive that might screw other things. So do we start our hardware? And that's one section. And if the hardware is secure, which Mark is going to keep saying no to, which is fine.
That's because he's securing it.
Yes, we're going to put on his hardware. So, but then if my hardware is secure and, and it's certified, I validated, whatever that entails, then the comms, and I'm going from LoRa to WAN to whatever, and then great. So that's secure. Now, Mark is going to want to do something with that data. So it's going to be on someone's cloud, and is that secure? And so anyway, this is how I've always thought of asking better questions, that before you give me your connected cowbell, there are many components in the cowbell. So what's secure? So anyway, I've always liked to start at a hardware, because there are very specific questions and documentation that if the vendor, the partner in question have performed, they should be able to show you before you even move into a pre-production environment to test. But I'm going to pass it to Mark, who's just, all he's saying is it's more money for security. It's more money for security.
No. Actually, I kind of agree with what you say, but I wouldn't think on IoT security as only as or we have to start from this place. You have to think on security as a whole, the whole system, not just the hardware. Because, if imagine that you have an IoT device or whatever. So if I want to hack your product, first thing that I will do, if I would be a hacker, that I'm not, is steal your computer and your mobile phone. That's all. Game over. You're fucked. I can become you, and I can do whatever I want. So you have to start from the computers from your employees, your own security at home, to the hardware and to the system on a chip. So
that's a good point, because I don't think when we think about IoT, you were talking about from the equipment all the way down edge cloud. No one's thinking about all the vulnerabilities that surround that sensor network, that system.
For me, the first vulnerability are the humans.
Yeah,
this type of system.
I agree, 100%. Yeah.
So, I mean, you can invest a lot of millions on research, on hardware security, on encryption of your LP1, whatever. All of this can be hacked kind of easily. So I wouldn't think the security as, we have to secure that layer. Because on IoT, we have a lot of layers. Never before had that amount of layers in the computer science before. Mm-hmm. So we go from the chip to the communication, to the cloud, to mobile application, and so on, and CRMs.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also has to do with what we're doing in terms of, just the way that we go to market with IoT applications. It's all, MVP, minimum viable product. You're doing the DevOps, but you're not necessarily adding the sec into the DevSecOps, right? So security is not top of mind. And when you look at ultra reliable, these low latency applications that now you're trying to broadcast over the wire, your packets have to be very, very small. So you become very, very judicious about how much, or you're limited in how much security you can apply for performance, right? And when you look at the brownfields, now that you're starting to connect everything, these devices are fundamentally and deeply vulnerable. Rob, you and I 2 years ago, we talked about Spectre meltdown. These side channel vulnerabilities down at the chip level, they haven't been addressed. They've been somewhat patched. But you have somebody who has ill intent getting access to the network can go and do some very, very deep damage to a particular environment, given what we are doing with IoT. Do you know what I'm saying? And it tends to what we tend to do is put security last and do things that are, quite frankly, dangerous, and a lot of it boils down to most folks don't understand how, dangerous the Internet of Things is from a security standpoint.
Like privacy in the sense. I'm going to weird. You know me. I'm all about the weird metaphors.
Yeah.
Privacy is one of those things that we don't fully agree on what it is. Some people just kind of ignore it. And the security side for IoT. One of the big problems we have is how do I describe this? To Mark's point about taking a systemic look at it, right? One of the key things is it's an arms race, right? It's just like with privacy, the social media companies are going to stay out in front of all the settings. You think you have control of it. By the way, watch Social Dilemma if you haven't yet. It's awesome.
Yes.
But the security race is it's an ongoing arms race between it's leapfrogging hackers and those who are trying to defend it. But what's important for that is what you just mentioned with like Spectre, for example, patching. How do we go out? How do we mitigate? We're not going to stop it. You can't.
Yeah.
How do we mitigate it in a timely manner when these vulnerabilities are exposed? That's not trivial, right? When you've got a fleet of 1 million devices out there, some of them aren't connected half the time, or they're on a LoRaWAN link that you can only dribble data down. How do you deal with that, right? How do you ensure that they're up to date? That's just a non-trivial thing to deal with. So
it's hard. I mean, you're talking about basic hygiene, but the more devices, the more machines, the more users. In my experience, where we've seen it fall apart is who's responsible for what. I might have a responsible, let's just call him an admin, who is making sure that mobile personal computing devices are patched and up to date, because if I lose one of these, I want to be protected, right? And there's that. But within the same company, if they are in industry, they might have some really old stuff that wasn't never inventoried, or there was never any orchestration as how do we maintain that things are patched. Then we get into I'm sorry, I'm running Windows 95 on this PLC 5 because there's nothing like it, and I'm going to keep on using it until it breaks, because it's a lot of money to exchange. So as basic as and simple as hygiene sounds, is tough to do at scale, unless this company in particular has, this is important to them, and then they invest in visibility. I mean, that's what it is. What are the tools out there that will give you visibility for you to do something as simple as, am I patched against X vulnerabilities?
Or can you say, I don't care? Let me throw this out there. One of the approaches is we continually update all the ultimate edge node devices, the sensors and controllers and smart products. alternative approach is we build intelligence into the gate. We basically take a strong gateway approach, right? Because adding that capability is not cheap, right? You're going to need power, you're going to need compute. If every device has to always be secure and up to date, an alternative would be to build increasing intelligence in a firewall, gateway, proxy device that understands that everything behind it may well be insecure. And that's actually an increasingly common use of like AI and ML stuff, right? Where you learn what normal usage patterns are, and you can kind of alert when weird packets start flowing. But anyway, that's an alternative approach that just give up in a way and not try and have every device be secured. Instead, security at the gates.
Well, don't you think all this stuff becomes even more complex as we hear more talk about, IoT and hybrid multi-cloud environments? You have all these different service providers who might not look at security or have security capabilities that are maybe are on par with what you need. So it seems like we continue to stretch and expand the complexity. And quite honestly, who the hell is good at this stuff? Is there anyone that's good at end-to-end? Because I know that there are companies that are looking at device management and securing things at the device hardware level, like what you're saying, David. But above that, the network, the applications, and then outside of your domain and the hybrid multi-vendor environment, how do you manage all this stuff? Because to your point, Marc, you're creating all these, you're dramatically expanding the attack surface and creating access points for malicious players to come in, either externally or even internally, to compromise systems, right?
But why do you need just one partner that does everything? Why don't you think on consortiums, on multi-companies consortiums that can solve these problems for companies?
I don't think one company can solve it all.
I don't think one company can. There's going to be the likes of Microsoft, the big players who are going to sit there and say, hey, look, we can provide you with secure multi-cloud, and we can secure IoT network, secure IoT devices. XYZ, Google probably try to do the same, or is trying to do the same thing, but I don't see any of them being, really all that successful. I mean, Rick.
Well, I mean, it's just more, it's accepting that it's a heterogeneous world, right? To Marc's point, it's going to take, every solution is a blend of products, services, software, but from a bunch of different vendors. So it does create, some best practice sharing, things like that. There are consortium on the industrial side, like the IIC. One of their big work products was best security practices. And again, that's kind of a really mission critical example. You're talking oil refineries, pipelines, mission critical stuff. But really what it was a group of people and vendors sharing best practices so that everybody could kind of use good hygiene to the point of something. I think that was a great choice of word.
Yeah, and there's a whole realm of vendors out there. You have your traditional network security companies, your hardware companies that are, really focusing on embedded security, your chipset companies that are also looking at the chipset level. But you also have these emerging IoT companies that are focusing heavily just on securing IoT devices or the IoT solution set. So there's such a wide range of vendors to bring in. So it has to be collaborative. It has to be consortium and best practice oriented, because like you said, this is a heterogeneous solution. We might have 5 or 6 vendors working in on one scaled solution for, especially as it gets bigger. So I think it can be quite confusing to those that are really trying to make decisions. You're gonna first go to your trusted solution providers, right? You talked about the big ones, Microsoft and others, but then the big security vendors, IP, internet security, and then those that are really focusing on core solutions at the specific industry solutions. there's a whole wide range. It's really confusing to the industry as we try to make decisions, you know. So I think that's a craze factor there.
You know, so yes, I agree. I partially agree with you, Stephanie, because I think where it gets a little bit less confusing, so still confusing, but less confusing, is once you go into a niche. You know, so for example, if we were to just say, hey, thousands of security vendors, different capabilities, but if we were to go industrial control system security, and all of a sudden that list just shrinks. And then as you talk to these and you ask, hey, you know, who are you servicing today? And what kind of equipment are you in today? Then the list shrinks.
Right.
And by the time you get sub-vertical, like, hey, I'm doing some connected frac pads in the Permian Basin. Who's really, and now you're like, oh, you need to talk to these two shops. So that's another thing that as the consumers, the buyer and the vendors need to be informed. It's like, hey, if there's an industry or a use case that you're really, really, really good at, lead with that. And it will prove itself out. And then a comment on the back of that, sticking to domain expertise, being end-to-end, then it's really a marketing term because it's going to be end-to-end of a part of the system, right? Marc described a whole system, and maybe doing something end-to-end within a system, maybe it's just not feasible or just too damn expensive. But you should be able to say, hey, I've got IP connectivity across this system. Can you deliver end-to-end IP level network security and visibility? And then you might get a yes. So anyway, that's where my head went as I wait for something.
I totally agree. I think the only way for big enterprise and government entities and anyone is to really drill out into the application. What are you doing? What's it specific for? And that's one of the things that Compass Intelligence has been helping customers with is trying to understand the ecosystem when you're drilling into a particular industry or use case or application, because there are so many vendors out there and many of them have failed, right? But there are some vendors that have been doing this for a long time before we started calling it IoT. Before we started talking about IoT security, they were already securing part of whatever that industry's technology solution. And they're still here. They're still around. So sometimes those legacy guys are the ones that we need to go to. But they might not even be considered an IoT security company, but they are. That's what they're doing.
Well, I know I'm just going to come across as a bored panda today here on security. I feel kind of jaded. I feel like I've had the same conversation 1,000 times. And I have not moved on past, 15 minutes ago when Marc already won the day on a comment he made about security, because I feel like I've already had this conversation 1,000 times, but Marc said something that we don't ever talk about. The employees are going to hack your system. You log into the ThingWorx portal or the Azure IoT portal or Lumada portal as a trusted person, and all bets are off for the whole thing. Where do you think most of, just in general, not IoT, most of the hack attacks are all inside jobs now, or they're phishing things and stuff like that?
A lot of benign events, but there's just a lot of nosy people.
Yeah, so we have been so focused on hardware and networks and every layer of the IoT stack that we all think of. And we always just like, oh, but I totally trust all those employees who are logged into the portal.
So they'll do something very malicious in an extremely secure way, right? I mean, that's all.
So,
it's super important because I absolutely agree, Rob. And one of the things is we can't, naively, I think the pipe and the device are honestly the easiest parts to solve. We are staying a step ahead. As long as you have good hygiene, good updates, the infrastructure is pretty decent. But as we go to the software side of it, first of all, two things happen. No system, very few systems are an island, right? You got to think network of networks. You want to optimize the energy network or your smart car, how it interacts with your solar panel. And then the utility. This complexity needs application level security in a new way. We have to start thinking about different, like what Rob's supposed to have access to of this piece of equipment is dramatically different than what Marc or Stephanie should. Secondly, when it starts spanning business boundaries, how do you manage that? How do you manage like the people identity across business boundaries, their permissions, what they're supposed to get into? And then last piece is the audit and monitoring. Again, maybe there are companies that have done network intrusion monitoring and things like that, but this is kind of at a different level. We are going to have to use AI and stuff like that. Just like Facebook is insisting they're going to have to use algorithmic approaches to weed out misinformation. It's kind of the same thing. There's no way humans can chew through logs and figure all this stuff out. So we're going to solve a human problem. We're not going to solve it. We'll have to mitigate it with technology.
Yeah. So someone's going to have to write code to in a cognitive way, understand that if a user that's legitimate, that's got access, whose identity has been verified, goes into X system to do something that, again, if the algorithm is trained well enough, that there will be contests like, wait a minute, you shouldn't be doing this because of all these other pieces. Yeah, that's the only, because, as you were thinking, as you were talking about identity, Rick, I thought of, whether, Azure or Losant or, all these platforms where I can assign roles, identities, and responsibility, access responsibilities. But, to Marc's point, if I'm in, I'm a verified user. I can.
They don't cross the boundary. That's the problem. You got to go do that in 100 different systems, right? And that's the dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, it might know it's David, but not what David's are.
Another interesting topic that Rick brought up before our session here was about multi-tenancy, which I found interesting. I'd love to hear your view on that.
Yeah. One is it's an interesting dilemma, right? A lot of companies say, we're going to protect you all from each other with a multi-tenant approach. And it's all about kind of just dividing, right? Little silos, some common backend. And by the way, increasingly, those same companies want to look at that population of users as a source of information for analytics and so you're already starting to mix that data and those systems back together on the back end. But how deep, fine-grained does multi-tenancy need to be, right? So imagine I'm a provider of some kind of intelligent lighting for cities, okay? And I'm Lightco, and I'm living in this tenant. But then I've got 160 municipalities that I need to then subcategorize, where I'm selling bulldozers and I have different distributors that need only access to the stuff that they sell and service. And that's what so you get to this super complex multi-tenancy thing, and how far, is it turtles all the way down? I don't know. But you keep going to the point where there is no single pattern for this. And then when you start to cross business boundaries and you actually want to, a lot of multi-tenancy, in a way we've deployed it, is to prevent the sharing and flow of information. And increasingly, that's actually what we want to have happen, to be able to easily cross.
I'd say it's total opposite for government. Many government agencies and departments, they have, and they're collecting their own data, but they don't want to share their data with other agencies and other departments. But at the same time, we're all pushing we've been pushing this for quite some time, the Open Government Initiative, where we're supposed to be sharing information. So if you have in a particular state the Department of Transportation, and then you have public safety, and they have great information and analytics and things that are happening, but gosh, wouldn't it be great for them to collaborate and see patterns and do all of these things to make smart decisions for the city? They're not doing that right now. And many of those that are controlling that data or managing that data for those departments and agencies, what we've heard back from those entities that are running that is they don't want to share their data. That's their data. So we have a whole conflict there, but yet we need systems in place to manage privacy, access, who gets it, and who, what kind of alerting is taking place. But we just don't have all of the parts in place right now for cities to do that. There are some that say they do that, but I haven't seen any that are doing this at a live scale event.
Did anybody see Palantir do that? I think it was Palantir did a retroactive analysis where they took data sets from a number of different government agencies with their approval. Again, I'm not 100% sure it was Palantir, but by combining those data sets, they were able to sift out and predict what happened on 9/11 was pretty clear, right? They were able to connect those dots. And that information sharing would have opened up insights that couldn't be gleaned from individual data sets. But to your point, how much, to whom, the whole kind of like next gen data mart, data sharing, if data is the monetization model for IoT, which we've discussed and we can debate, it's a key part of it. Someone's got to figure that out. How do we share data in a kind of a new, secured and granular way?
Yeah. Do you remember, I'm going to paraphrase this, I'm sure I got it wrong. I remember Larry Ellison at one point saying multi-tenancy is for suckers or something like that. As far as security or blocking things, he just didn't believe in it. He just thought it was never going to work. It would break down. I know everybody has different experiences.
I don't understand why.
I don't know. A lot of people think of multi-tenancy, or when they're building a server solution, they usually use the database to do multi-tenancy and different keys and stuff like that. And that's how they divide companies. And I'm sure Larry was thinking from his viewpoint as an Oracle database guy, but he also it was the early days of the cloud and VMs and things like that. And he was probably just thinking, yeah, this is not going to work out. We need.
Yeah, he's probably thinking, well, if you have one so he's thinking of it from a service provider's perspective, right? Because he comes from a world where enterprises are buying his database software and installing everything in their, the enterprise colo centers or their on-prem data centers. So. But he may have a point. So if you have these critical systems and sensitive data being hosted in a multi-tenant environment, not only you have two levels of privileged access. Actually, there's one. It's a service provider, and then you have sort of this proxy privilege access with your particular instance, right? Or virtual environment, depending on what. And Rick, I don't know. You might be making a great case for people to say screw it to the cloud for anything that's important.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying different approaches. We need a.
Well, it's a different way of looking at what you were arguing, because if you have now we start getting into these hybrid multi-cloud, multi-vendor implementations of let's say a system, because it can be very complex, right? If we're assuming that most enterprises aren't going to go with a single vendor or a single service provider for their quote unquote IoT, that becomes jacked up. That's a really scary security environment, because now you have all these different folks who have potential privileged access to aspects of your environment, if not the whole thing. How do you manage?
I don't think that changes cloud or on-prem. Those are sort of like application level practices, right? But I actually think almost the opposite, Leonard, that it's going to be easier for one of the bigger cloud vendors or bigger tech vendors to solve that. Every customer doesn't want to try and solve that problem, right? That needs to be an infrastructural problem. How can tenants, it actually is an interesting problem when you want to share data across tenants. And then to your point, now amplify that by cross cloud vendor, right? How do we do that in a secure, and there are a new breed of vendors definitely trying to address this kind of like, it's not just a virtual data lake, it's a virtual service fabric that kind of lives across this. But We're still early in that game, but whoever cracks that code, I really believe it's like paramount, because
but everyone's going to market with that. And, the question still is out there whether or not they have their act together in terms of holistic solutions.
valid question. Yeah.
But I mean,
on the back end of all these there's some sysop, some techie somewhere who has the keys to the kingdom, right? Who can get to every tenant and do everything they want, circling all the way back to the human factors element, which is just we often overlook.
Yeah. So you have trusted vendors.
And going back to the human factor and Mark, stealing people's computers and mobile phones to screw up with a dual factor authentication. But then it's funny, we haven't talked about the physical side of IoT security. What happens when human, but not the employee, just the external human, getting physical access to whatever we're calling as IoT. Because I bet the level of challenge is very different trying to access a data center, with key cards and cameras and security and personnel and multi-floors and all this stuff, versus I know that this operator here, it's industrial. I always go back to the industrial side, but how difficult would it be for me to physically gain access to a facility, and with the cunning use of not of a cowbell, but of a USB stick, just put something in there? Because so the physicality of it. Please, because then I also want your comments on air gapping, which I don't agree with, but I want to hear it.
So many industrial enterprises, manufacturing being a big use case, has massive amounts of turnover, right? It just, not all of them, but it's a big problem. Talent, people are moving. So it's amazing how many of these systems don't bother setting up individual users, right? They still have the operator line 1 login or the supervisor login. So you lose that personal accountability, right? No one knows who I was or who did that. Reliable identity and the audits that go along with that are just as important for the people side of things and all the if we can reliably prove it was me or you or Stephanie or whomever, and that information is being logged, it's going to change your behavior a little bit, right? Secondly, the same is true of the devices. I used to use an example all the time about the importance of reliable digital identity on device, and maybe we've covered it in this chat, but imagine a sensor in the Lincoln Tunnel that's responsible for radiologic or biologic sensing, and someone decides to spoof it and say, hey, there's high levels of radiation in the Lincoln Tunnel, and they shut down Manhattan, right? Well, there's huge financial impact to that. But all it wasn't a real reading. It was something that didn't need reliable digital identity, couldn't prove that it in fact was that sensor. So it's just as much rogue devices that can cause issues as rogue people. Maybe not to the same degree today, but.
I agree. I said on a panel, it's been a year and a half or 2 ago, but that was one of our conversations. Was they had actual incidents where someone went up to a computer, unplugged the USB plug that was already in use for something, and unplugged it so they could charge their phone. But was just very basic physical activities of people messing with wires because they either wanted to wreak havoc or they were just trying to charge their phone. So it's like, we need sensors on our own sensor networks, right? So we should be able to be alerted on some of these things that says, hey, it's a very basic thing that just happened. Someone just unplugged a very important part of your network. And that's why it's not working right now. And
that's what David was asking about the air gap. I mean, there's a anecdotal, it's way more than anecdotal story about the third shift operators, which we called it the blue hose, right? They want to be able to check Facebook from the terminal on line 3. And somehow somebody told them, hey, if you plug this thing into this, just remember to take it out before you leave. You're busting the air gap. And air gaps aren't obviously 100% either, but anyway. there's still a lot of them being used in that domain.
They're not bad.
Out of everything we just said, the most shocking thing was Stephanie, because I realized that panel she talked about, that was in person.
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Those were awesome.
Whoa.
Remember those?
Yeah, related with David's comment, that's really interesting, no? Because let me give you another example. Let's talk about the smart meters. You just take some aluminum foil from home, go to visit your smart meter, your beloved smart meter. You just put all your aluminum foil around your smart meter, and probably you will pay $0 on the next invoice. On the next.
Can you send me the details on that?
No, I didn't say that, but
That's like listed on the home hacks.
That was actually one of the early apps I heard about. C3, one of the AI and IoT pioneers. One of the apps was smart meter fraud detection, and again, looking at patterns and things like that.
yeah, but that opens the door into the IoT security. We should take into account as well that the data, it's properly captured or not. That's IoT security, or that gets into another, because we are not talking about the data, no?
Sure.
The data captured. So
Right.
I mean,
Generally, when we're talking about data, we're talking about the data that we're solving the solution for, or alerting, or whatever, or action. We're not talking about the data that we're collecting on the security side to see anomalies or patterns or something out of whack. But yeah.
There's a mythology, again, it's a mythology thing that sensors are accurate. Sensors aren't accurate. If you go to an industrial environment, there are like hordes of technicians whose job it is to do periodic sensor recalibration. Now we're hanging all these sensors all over our cities and buildings. You think anybody's going out and recalibrating those? Probably not. I would bet against it.
No.
We've got our garbage data is like increasing at a record clip.
you have to read about the blockchain oracles that actually confirm that the data is correct.
That's right.
You have to read more about that.
When in doubt, just put more blockchain in.
Yeah, it's you beat me to it, because I was just going to say that I wanted to use the word immutability without referring to blockchain, but in the context of, to Marc's point, how do I make sure that the data that I receive is accurate? But there are ways to do that.
That's not accurate, though. That simply says that it hasn't been changed. This is a big issue, right? So
semantics, please.
Right,
please.
but you go to and that's one of the challenges is just because something got written into a blockchain doesn't mean it wasn't garbage upstream, right? So it is a big challenge. And this is, again, where audit, software-driven intelligent systems can figure out what looks anomalous. They're not going to catch everything. It's just like, your credit. I don't know about you, but I think the credit card fraud algorithms are pretty dialed right now. Usually when they call, it's something that's something's up.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of how you can evolve those algorithms.
Yeah, and Rick, you're making a great point. And there's a huge difference between privacy, trust, and security. And there's too many people conflating the three. Some people think that trust is privacy. No, privacy is not trust. And if you don't know how these three things play with each other, then especially if you're a CISO, you need to go and get educated, because trust is going to be, it is not even going to be, it is right now something we need badly, right? Especially with the deep fakes and the fake crap that's out there. We need something to protect us from falsehood.
Ironically, the same algorithms that are generating the deep fakes would be the ones that would validate that that's legit, right?
Right.
It's a legit.
You know what? We're screwed. Let's just.
Can we get back to the topic of Internet of Chastity?
Oh.
So that should be included in the links so that the community understands.
We'll be providing visuals, and I'll provide you another visual.
Yeah, they won't be showing this in the classroom.
We could be talking about this forever. Ooh, okay. We need to reload. So, hey guys, great discussion. To our IoT Coffee Talk followers and listeners, thanks for watching us rant. And remember to subscribe, like this episode, www.iotcoffeetalk.com. and we will talk to you next week, right?
Never miss keg day.
Yeah.
And just to celebrate the Oktoberfest, that it's not happening. I'm just drinking from.
That
from
is a nice
That's
beer.
very
Fill your kegs with beer, IPA from the Northwest.
There you go. Party on, Wayne.
Lone Star Light,
Party
baby.
on, Garth.
Bye.
See you guys.
Adios.